With today's modern high-power RCs and giant connectors, proper soldering technique and equipment is essential, and today we're going to learn everything there is to know about both. Soldering is a method of joining two metals together where you don't actually melt the parent metal. When employing a welding method such as MIG, TIG, or gas welding, you get the parent metal hot enough to where it actually melts and creates an alloy with the welding material that you're using. Whereas with soldering, while you are getting that parent metal hot, you aren't actually melting it to create the joint. Now, soldering's been around a surprisingly long time. As you can see here, these artifacts are from the Greco-Roman era, and even back then they were soldering things together. Of course, those weren't electrical solder connections, they were mechanical solder connections. And of course, they weren't using modern soldering irons. They were using irons that actually looked like irons. You would put these in a fire, get them hot, and then use them for soldering. Soldering has been around since at least 3000 BC, and it was used for all kinds of things, including fine jewelry. So what exactly is soldering? What's going on when you heat a metal and apply solder to it? This is a fairly straightforward process where you heat the metal and then you apply the material to it. In this case, it's a tin-lead combination, and that material actually dissolves a very small amount of that metal and creates a chemical bond between the two. Essentially what's happening here is the two different metals are turning into one single metal at a very small level right where they join together. There are several different types of soldering, including silver soldering, hard soldering, plumbing soldering, electrical soldering, and even brazing, which is essentially the same as soldering, just done at a higher temperature. All of these rely on that surface chemical reaction to create a bond between the two metals, and this is why it's so important to have a clean surface to bond to. The surface of most bare metals will quickly react with oxygen in the air and create an oxide layer. That's true of copper and even of this 7075 aluminum. By the way, if you want to see me machine this 7075 aluminum as well as some forged carbon fiber into RC car parts, make sure you get subscribed because I've got a CNC machine coming soon and that's going to be a fun video. Now that metallic oxide layer forms very, very quickly, and even something that looks bright and clean like this still has an oxide layer on it, and that oxide layer will actually prevent solder from doing what's known as wetting the metal. Wetting the metal is what happens when the metal gets hot enough and the solder can actually flow onto and into the metal itself. That oxide layer will almost always prevent metal from wetting, and that's why most solder has what's known as flux built into it. As you can see here from this cutaway, the very center of this solder has a duller part in it. That dull part is the flux, and it's that flux that creates the smoke when you melt the solder. By the way, we're going to talk about why that smoke always goes towards your face in just a few minutes, so make sure you stay tuned for that. Without that flux, it becomes very difficult to create a solder joint, which is why if I melt a big blob of solder onto my soldering iron, let that flux burn off, and then try to get the solder to stick to the wire, it'll mostly just sit on top of the wire without actually wetting the wire. This is because that oxide layer is not getting dissolved and the wire simply won't accept the solder. Most electronic solder you buy will have some sort of flux in it. This actually is rosin core. Rosin's actually a natural material that's obtained from pine trees and has been used as a flux for many, many years. The flux, whether you get it in solder or you use something like a flux pen here, when heated actually dissolves the oxide layer and allows the solder to stick to the bare metal underneath. And this is where we're starting to run into trouble with these modern giant ESCs and connectors. In order for the flux to properly clean and especially the solder to properly wet, the wire itself has to be hot enough. The problem with this is that electrical conductors are also generally really good heat conductors. And what happens when you take this iron and stick it onto the metal is it immediately starts pulling heat away from the iron and down into the metal, and it starts getting hot. If your iron isn't powerful enough to dump enough heat into that wire fast enough, it's never going to get hot enough to actually wet with the solder. A typical soldering iron temperature for melting lead or lead-free solder is between 600 and 700 degrees Fahrenheit. As you can see, I've got this Heiko FX888D set to 750 degrees, and that's because I'm trying to compensate for the lack of power that this soldering iron has. Here we have a simple piece of 10 gauge wire freshly stripped, and I'm just going to go ahead and put my soldering iron on here and start adding some solder. As you'll see, that's going to start wetting the metal, and it looks like we're getting a nice solder connection here. We've got nice, bright, wet metal here with solder flowing into it, and that looks pretty darn good. We've got solder all over it. However, if I flip this wire over, as you can see, there is no solder on the bottom whatsoever, and it doesn't matter how long I hold the soldering iron on there, it's not going to get to the bottom. No problem though, we'll just go ahead and put some solder on the bottom as well, right? And now we've got the bottom all nice and wetted too. Looks really, really good. But now if I cut this open at an angle, You can see we didn't actually get solder all the way through. And that's in spite of the fact that I'm using the widest tip you can get for this Hakko iron. I'm using very good lead-based solder, and I had the iron on there for plenty of time. What's happening here is the heat from the iron is being wicked down this wire, and it never actually gets the center of the wire hot enough for the solder to wick in and wet that part of the wire. And this is just a fairly common 10-gauge wire. Modern large ESCs are coming with 8-gauge wire, which is even worse. Now, can this iron create a good bond with these types of wires and connections? It can, but it's pretty difficult. And if you aren't paying close attention, there's a good chance you're not going to get one. You also run the risk of creating so much heat, especially when you're soldering to a connector. We'll talk about how to solder to connectors in a minute, that you end up melting your connector. And some of these big connectors are expensive. And this is where the difference between temperature and thermal capacity come in. As you can see here, this is a 65-watt soldering iron, and no matter how far you crank up the temperature, the most energy it can put into these wires is that 65 watts. And if the connection you're soldering to is able to dissipate that much heat, you're never going to get a good connection. And that's why, whereas this FX888D is great for smaller wires, things like XT90s and EC5s, if you're going to be going with big power, you're going to need a soldering iron with big power. That's why today I'm going to be retiring my venerable FX888D and upgrading to something with a little more power. Not only does this JBC clone have a 200-watt output, but it also has a direct heater cartridge, which means the heating element's actually built into the end of the soldering iron tip rather than the tip going over the heating cartridge, which makes thermal transfer a lot better. Now, obviously, most of you guys aren't going to have a soldering iron that's this powerful, so we're going to go ahead and switch back to the FX888D because it is capable of doing most soldering jobs. What are those soldering jobs going to be? Typically in this hobby, it's going to be soldering wires to connectors and wires to wires. Let's talk about wires to wires first. There are three main ways to solder two wires together, and which one you use just depends on the type of connection you're looking for. The first way, and the way I do not recommend, is just sticking the two wires end to end like this and then soldering them together. This is known as a butt joint, and whereas you can technically solder two wires together using this type of joint, the result's going to be a very weak joint both mechanically and electrically. There really isn't a lot of surface area, and it'll break easily as well as not conduct electricity very well. The next type of joint is a splice joint where you lay the wires side by side and then solder them together. To accomplish this, we just pre-tin the wires. Pre-tinning just means getting enough solder into the wire to where it's completely wetted. And then basically you just hold the wires next to each other and remelt that solder. A good splice joint should have solder all the way around it without any bare wire showing in the middle. This makes a good electrical connection and a surprisingly strong mechanical connection, though electrical solder generally isn't considered a mechanical connector. And that's where the next type of joint, known as a lineman's splice, comes into play. If you need maximum mechanical strength and you have plenty of wire to work with, what you can do is strip them pretty far back, hold them at about 50% length to each other, and then start twisting them together. Twist one end around the other, and then twist the other end around the first one, and then you want to solder these together. This type of joint is often used for solid wire connections, but can be used for stranded wire as well, and it creates a very strong mechanical joint. Now, that being said, just how strong is a standard splice joint? Let's find out. I'm going to pre-tin these little wires here. We are going to splice joint them together, and I'm going to pull on this as hard as I can, and let's see what gives. So as you can see, first the insulation came off, then the wire strands themselves broke apart. And that kind of makes sense because whereas the solder itself isn't as strong as the parent material, often when you get a failure of wire, it's going to be strands that break individually, not everything breaking at once. And each one of these individual strands isn't as strong as this joint is. That being said, you definitely don't want to use a solder joint in a mechanical application. Now, typically after we've soldered two wires together, we're going to want to insulate this connection somehow. And you've got a few different options. You can use electrical tape. I definitely don't recommend it. Even good electrical tape is going to degrade and fail over time. You can use regular heat shrink tubing, or you can use what I recommend here, and this is adhesive lined heat shrink tubing. This heat shrink actually has glue inside of it, and when you put it over a connection and then heat it up to shrink it, that glue will actually melt out. You can see it oozing out both ends. Not only does that create a stronger connection than regular heat shrink, but it also creates a waterproof connection if you do it correctly. Regular heat shrink, electrical tape, and things like that can let moisture get into the connection, and that can cause corrosion to form, which can end up killing your joint in time. As you can see here, according to NASA, both the splice joint and the lineman joint are perfectly valid ways of joining wire. And if you want to learn their specifications for it, I definitely recommend Googling it because there's a ton of really good information in their paperwork. But now for the topic you guys are probably most interested in, and that's soldering connectors. To show you that, let's install this Max 5 G2 into my beast of a Traxxas XRT, and then you know we're going to be taking this thing for a rip. A lot of times before you can solder a connector, you have to desolder the connector because you're going to be reusing your connectors. This is generally not a problem. When soldering or desoldering connectors, it's a really good idea to get a connector of the other gender and plug them into each other. This does two things. It increases the thermal mass of the connector, which helps prevent them from melting. And if it does end up getting a little hot and soft, it keeps the pins in the right place. I found that these QS8s tend to not have a melting problem, and they've already got enough thermal mass that it's a problem for soldering, so I don't recommend plugging two QS8s together when you're soldering or desoldering them. Whether you're soldering or desoldering, you want to start with a fairly clean tip. Most soldering stations are going to come with a sponge you can wet or a piece of wool that you can rub the tip down in. This tip is not the cleanest in the world, but as long as you get most of the old solder off, it'll work pretty well. In order to desolder, you're going to want to add more solder. This might seem counterintuitive, but if you just put your soldering iron on here, it's not really going to transfer much heat, and it could take a long time for it to actually heat up that solder and melt it, which could end up melting your connector. If you add a little extra solder, it increases that heat transfer, and then usually you can take that connector right off. Unless it's really, really bad, the solder that's left behind usually isn't a problem and can be reused. Though in many applications, if you need to remove solder, this solder wick is a great product. It's a braided piece of copper with flux in it. Its high surface area allows it to absorb a lot of solder, and it'll draw it off pretty much any other surface. As you can see here, it's already sucked up some solder. Again, though, you generally don't need to worry about that for connectors. Okay, now we just need to get these QS8s soldered onto this Max 5 G2, but before we do that, we need to briefly talk about safety. Whether you're in a country where leaded solder is legal or you live in a country where it's illegal, there are still several safety concerns to keep in mind when soldering. First of all, a hot soldering iron is hot. The solder itself is hot, whatever you're soldering is hot, the flux splatter is going to be hot, and basically everything is just hot. You need to be really careful because you're going to end up burning yourself if you're not. Now let's briefly talk about the solder itself. If you're in a lead-free country, this isn't nearly as much of a concern, but leaded solder has lead in it. The danger of lead is if it gets in your body. Fortunately, lead doesn't really absorb through your skin very well, so touching it isn't going to hurt you, especially if you're only soldering occasionally. If your business is soldering and you're soldering every day, that might be a different concern. But touching this, getting particles on your fingers, and then putting those fingers in your mouth is a concern, even if you're soldering occasionally. There is no acceptable level of lead exposure, and lead is bad for you no matter how much of it you get in you, so just be careful with it. Now, the smoke you see here is not lead smoke. Lead melts at these temperatures, but it doesn't evaporate at these temperatures. However, this is flux smoke, and flux smoke also isn't good for you. As we stated previously, every time you solder, that smoke is going to go straight to your face. I'll tell you why in just a minute, and that's why we have things like this, a fume extractor. This thing is just a fan with a filter, and its primary job is just to get those fumes out of your face. These work really well. I haven't been using it in this video because it's loud and I'm talking, but generally speaking, I do use this. There are much higher end fume extractors you can use if you're doing a lot of soldering, but for just occasional soldering, something like this fan-based one isn't expensive, and they do work pretty well. Now on to soldering these connectors. Once you've pre-tinned your wires, and it is possible to pre-tin even these thick wires with a soldering iron that isn't that powerful, you just have to really give it a lot of time, make sure the solder gets in there, and hold it here for a long time. This is silicone wire. This silicone insulation isn't going to melt on you, so you've got the time. Just again, make sure you remember that it's going to be hot when it's done, so be careful not to touch this wire because this entire wire is going to get hot enough to burn you. Once you've got everything pre-tinned, make sure you take a second to think about how everything's going to be oriented when it's soldered. You want these connectors to be pointing in the right direction when everything's soldered together so your wires aren't twisted up, and you can do that just by thinking about how you want them to be oriented and then orienting your ESC in the proper location as you're soldering. Once you've got everything pre-tinned, you can just lay your wire in the connector, touch the soldering iron to the wire. The solder on the wire will melt, and then as you hold it there, you're going to feel the wire kind of fall into the cup once the solder in the cup itself starts to melt. On a big connector like this, it could take a few seconds, especially with a soldering iron like this, but you will feel it happen. There it goes. And then just pull the iron away and then hold it until it solidifies. This wire is getting very hot. Be careful, you will burn yourself if you're not. And then when you're done, you want to desolder that and feed the wire through the cap, which you forgot to do ahead of time. Now, this is what I would consider a perfectly acceptable solder joint. Yes, you can still see the shape of the wire in here, but guess what? NASA also would consider this to be a perfectly acceptable solder joint. As you can see here in their documentation, they recommend a 75 75% minimum fill, and they don't recommend letting the solder go up above the cup in a cup joint. This is at least 75% fill, the solder is nice and shiny, and this will work just fine, but I'll put my money where my mouth is. We're gonna run this thing in the truck, put some heavy load on it, then I'll take my infrared camera and show you what the temperatures are on these connectors and where they're the hottest. You might also say that the stick out here is a little bit short, and yeah, you could go a little bit longer, but this should be plenty enough for a low resistance connection. The concern if you don't have a good enough connection is you could end up with a high resistance area in the electrical path, and high resistance creates heat. Basically, you've created a resistive heater like you would use in your bedroom in your house. That high resistance and heat can lead to a chain reaction, and you can actually end up damaging your equipment because of things like voltage sag. This is one reason why I never recommend using adapters when running unless you've made the adapter yourself. People who make those adapters tend to make them out of the cheapest materials possible, and they don't solder them correctly. I've seen a ton of ESC failures where people were using those adapters. As you can see, I intentionally wired these up incorrectly. We've got the black negative wire from the ESC going to the positive wire on the connector, and the positive wire from the ESC going to the black negative wire on the connector. This was just to show you what can happen. If you plug this in, it would definitely blow up the ESC. I definitely didn't do this on accident because I wasn't paying attention because I'm making this video. Fortunately or unfortunately, I've blown up a couple of ESCs wiring them backwards in the past, so I'm in the habit of double and triple checking my connections. If you're doing any kind of soldering, make sure you get in that habit as well. It'll save you some pretty expensive hardware in the long run because you are going to make this mistake just like I did. I mean, I did it on purpose. And there we go, guys. She's all set to go. Let's get some 4S packs in this thing and see just how good my soldering job is. As you can see here, the connectors themselves did get pretty warm, but on the ends where the solder joints are, it's actually cooler than it is in the middle. And in some places, the wires themselves are actually hotter than those solder joints are. And so ultimately, it seems like NASA has it right. And as long as you have at least a 75% fill, which this is obviously way more than 75%, and the wires themselves are completely wetted and mostly covered, this joint is going to be just fine. And anything else you put on top of that's probably just going to be a waste. Now, probably the last and by far the most dangerous type of soldering we're going to want to do in this hobby is putting new connectors on batteries. This is dangerous because you're going to be working very close to the positive and negative connections, and if you short those out, there's a ton of energy in these batteries. It's going to dump through those connections, and it's going to be a really bad time. The best way to make sure you don't have a bad time is to keep yourself very organized and take your time while doing this. I'm going to go ahead and quickly pre-tin my new connector. This is an XT60. Doesn't take much or very long. I've got my cap ready to go, and what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to take one of these wires at a time, and I'm going to cut it off. Don't cut both of them at the same time, just cut one of them. Keeping an eye on everything that I'm doing and making sure that this wire doesn't go someplace it shouldn't, keeping that negative wire far away from it. We'll get this pre-tinned, and then we're gonna solder it on, making sure we're soldering to the right terminal. Now, here's where things get really dicey. You've got a bare connector here that has to stay bare, and you're gonna go ahead and cut the negative wire. Okay, so here's where we really need to focus. We're gonna cut the end of this wire off. Now, making sure it doesn't get anywhere near the stuff over here, we're gonna strip the end off. I'm gonna put it in my little holder here so it doesn't accidentally flop around. We're gonna pre-tin it. And now very, very carefully, we're gonna put it through the cap. Again, don't let it touch that other wire. And this is the most dangerous part right here because you have to solder right next to the other connector. I'm gonna use my little holder here, which helps a lot. And we're just gonna solder it up. And there we go. We've put our cap on and we've successfully soldered a new connector onto this battery. Again, just make sure you're very, very careful. Take your time. A great idea is if you're not really confident about this, just do it outside. That way, if something happens to the battery, you can just throw it and get out of the way, and you don't have a potential disaster in your house. One final time, doing this is very dangerous. You do so at your own risk. By the way, I just soldered this connector on this battery for demonstration purposes only. These G2 batteries require that data line because they don't have a separate balance connector. So just soldering another connector on here wouldn't actually work on these G2 batteries without going in and soldering a balance connector on, which I don't recommend you do unless you really, really know what you're doing. Again, this was just to show you soldering a connector onto a battery. So why is it that smoke comes straight towards you when you're soldering? A really great channel called Alpha Phoenix did a video on this, and what he discovered was you're blocking 3 different sides when you're soldering, left hand, right hand, and your body behind it. The heat from the soldering iron draws air up, and since you're blocking air coming from 3 different directions, the only place it can come from to replace it is in front of you. That causes a directed draft that blows the smoke right into your face. An easy solution, of course, is just to use one of those extractors I showed you earlier. I do want to briefly cover cleaning. That rosin is acidic and it can cause problems in solder joints. Usually with big solder joints like this, it's not that big of a deal, but if you do want to clean it up, and technically you should, a little bit of alcohol and a Q-tip or a paper towel dissolves the rosin or most fluxes very, very quickly, and it leaves a nice clean joint. I usually don't on big connections like this, but it is best practice. So what equipment do I recommend when you want to solder? First thing you're going to need is a soldering iron. This Hakko FX888D is a fairly inexpensive and really, really good option as long as you're not soldering really, really large wires. If you're soldering really large wires, you're going to need a more powerful iron. And if you go higher power, what you buy just depends on your budget. For solder, you want to get a good name brand solder. This Kester solder is not cheap, but it's really, really good, and solder lasts a very long time. A roll like this will last you years of casual soldering, and it's absolutely worth getting the name brand solder for a better soldering experience. You can buy a flux pen, though I don't usually use it in this hobby. It is nice to have if you're going to be soldering electronics or something like that. And then something like a set of helping hands and or something like this terminal holder is a fantastic upgrade to just holding things with your hands or with a pair of pliers. I use this thing all the time. It's got places to put little pin terminals in here, places to hold wires, and something like this doesn't cost a lot of money. I personally don't use my helping hands that much. I use this thing most of the time, so I definitely recommend picking something like this up. And you know what? If you made it this far into the video, you're a true fan of this channel, so I'm going to reward you by giving one of these away. All you need to do is make sure you're subscribed, put a comment down in the comments section, and I'll be picking a winner for one of these very soon. Some solder wick, though I don't use it very often, again, in this hobby, is a great thing to have on hand just in case you need it. Again, go name brand, Chemtronics, Chemwick, great stuff, expensive, but 25 feet's going to last you probably a decade of casual soldering. And then finally, you want to buy name brand tips. Don't get the cheap Amazon 10 tips for $20 pack. If you have a Hakko iron, get Hakko tips. You will have an easier and better soldering experience if you do. Obviously, to go along with all that stuff, you're going to want things like flush cutters and other tools, but ultimately with a decent soldering iron, some good solder, and something to hold your parts in, you're going to have a pretty good experience. And if you're new to soldering, the best advice I can give you is just get some wire, find an old circuit board, whatever you can find that you can put solder on, and just sit down and practice. Soldering is a skill. It doesn't come naturally, and the more you practice, the better at it you'll get. I'm not an expert at this, but I've been doing it for about 20 years, and I have a decent amount of experience with it. And being able to solder is probably one of the best skills you can have in this hobby because there's lots of times when it comes in really, really handy. Do you have any awesome tips or tricks that you use for soldering? Let everyone know down in the comments, and let's share the knowledge. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in one of these videos.